Late October on an Ozark ridge smells of rotting sumac and wet limestone. The sky runs the color of a cleaned rifle barrel, and the wind comes from the northwest with an edge that passes through coat cloth as though it is not there. The cedar trees along the bluff have gone dark. The creeks below run thin and cold over gravel that will freeze solid before Christmas. A woman stands in the doorway of a woodshed built against the hill, her dog beside her hands raw. Behind her, the stacked wood does not reach the second crossbeam. On the far wall, a fresh crack in the rock breathes air that should not be warm. Randy Brecka had been a widow for 11 days when the storekeeper cut her credit. She stood at the counter of Pike's General Merchandise with 2 sacks of cornmeal weighed and waiting, a tin of lamp oil, and a paper twist of 10-penny nails she needed to patch the north wall before the first hard frost. Judson Pike spread her account ledger flat on the pine boards and tapped the bottom line with one thick finger. $28. The coffin. The freight charge for hauling Amos down from the tie camp on a borrowed wagon. The nails from August. A salt pork credit from July that Amos had sworn he would settle after the Oakbolt contract paid. Pike did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said, "I cannot carry this past Christmas, Mrs. Brecka. You understand that." Randy understood. She understood that the 2 sacks of cornmeal on the counter would cost her $1.15 she did not have. She understood that $11.40 remained in the coffee tin behind the stove, money she had counted 3 times since Amos died, as though counting might change the sum. She understood that the note Pike held meant he could lien her timber come spring, and if she signed the paper he was already sliding across the counter, he would own the right to cut every oak and hickory on her ridge before she could sell a single bolt herself. She did not sign. She left the nails and the lamp oil. She took the cornmeal on promise of eggs she did not yet have, and she walked the 4 miles back up the ridge road, with the sacks balanced across the mule's back, and Kavit trotting ahead, his white coat dirty with creek mud, and his nose working the cold air as though winter were something he could smell coming. It was the 3rd week of October, 1904. The Ozark Ridge above the current river country smelled of rotting sumac and wet limestone. The sky was the color of a cleaned rifle barrel, and the wind came from the northwest with an edge that went through coat cloth like it was not there. Randy was 34 years old. She had been born in a Norwegian settlement in western Wisconsin, the 3rd daughter of Peter Solheim, a man who built root cellars the way other men built churches, with patience, plumb lines, and an unreasonable faith in the keeping power of stone. She had married Amos Brecka at 22 because he was steady, because he laughed easily, and because he had a ridge claim in southern Missouri where the timber was good and the land cost nothing but labor. They had no children. 12 years of trying, 12 years of silence on the subject, and now 12 years of marriage compressed into a pine box that she still owed $28 on. The claim was 160 acres of steep Ozark hillside. Legal in her name now, the Homestead Act did not care whether a widow had sons, only whether she could prove continuous residence and keep paying taxes. But legal ownership and actual survival were different problems. The cabin was 16 by 20 feet, 1 room and a sleeping loft, with an attached woodshed built into the back slope where the hill met the limestone bluff. Amos had planned to re-chink the north wall in September. Amos had planned to cut 6 cords of oak before the leaves turned. Amos had planned a great many things before the tie camp wagon tipped on a wash grade and caught him underneath. What Randy had: 1 3/4 cords of mixed oak and hickory stacked in the shed, 1 lame mule that could not drag timber, 1 white farm dog, 30 pounds of dried beans, the 2 sacks of cornmeal, a half barrel of sorghum, and the $11.40. A stove that drew well when the wind behaved and smoked the cabin blind when it did not. A north wall where the clay daubing cracked every time the stove ran hot, letting in threads of cold air that you could feel with a wet finger from 4 feet away. What she needed, 6 cords minimum, according to every man on the ridge, a sound roof, chinking that held, money for taxes, for lamp oil, for the nails to close the gaps, for the coffee and salt and baking powder that made the difference between surviving and merely not dying, and time she did not have, because the Ozark winter did not negotiate. Asa Merriweather came on the 9th day of November. He rode a dun gelding up the ridge trail with his coat collar turned against a spitting rain that had been falling since dawn. Merriweather was 68 years old, former Union quartermaster, and the most respected winter hand in the settlement. He had buried 2 wives, raised 4 sons who had all gone to Kansas or Indian Territory, and spent 40 years learning exactly how much coal the Ozark Ridge could produce, and exactly how much wood, chinking, and stubbornness it took to outlast it. When Merriweather said a thing about winter, people wrote it down. He did not knock. He tied the gelding, walked the perimeter of the cabin with the unhurried patience of a man inspecting a company position, and then stood at the woodshed door looking at the stacked oak and hickory with an expression that Randy could read from the cabin window without hearing a word. She came out anyway. Kavit circled Merriweather's boots once, sniffed, and sat. "Mrs. Breck," Merriweather said. He removed his hat because he was that kind of man. "I told Harlan Pierce I would look in on you." "I did not ask anyone to look in on me." "No, you did not." He put his hat back on and turned to the woodshed. "May I?" She nodded. He walked inside. She heard him counting under his breath, the same way her father had counted, moving his lips, tapping each row. When he came out, rain had darkened his shoulders, and his face had settled into something that was not pity, but was worse. It was certainty. "You have 1 3/4 cords," he said. "Mixed. Some of it green. That hickory on the left has sap still running. Green wood gives you half the heat and twice the smoke." "I know what green wood does." "Then you know you have fuel for November, not winter." He looked at the north wall, where a crack ran from the sill log to the second course. "Your chinking is gone in 3 places I can see from here. That wall will bleed heat faster than your stove can make it. You will burn through what you have by Christmas, and you will have 3 months of cold left and nothing to feed it." Randy said nothing. The rain ticked on the woodshed roof. Kavit pressed his flank against her leg. Merriweather was not cruel. He was the kind of man who delivered bad news plainly because he believed plain truth was kinder than a false comfort. He looked at the mule standing hip-shot in the pen, favoring its left foreleg, and he looked at the cabin, and he looked at Randy. "You have people in Wisconsin," he said. "I have a sister in Eau Claire who takes in wash for 3 boarders. She has no room. The county seat has a women's home run by the Methodists. It is not charity. They put you to work. This is my claim. Amos and I proved it together. If I leave, Pike files abandonment and buys the timber rights for the cost of back taxes. He told me so himself." Merriweather's jaw tightened. He disliked Pike. Most of the ridge did. But disliking Pike did not change the arithmetic. "Mrs. Brecka, I have wintered on this ridge for 37 years. I have seen men with full woodsheds and sound cabins freeze to death because the cold came harder than they planned. You do not have a full woodshed. You do not have a sound cabin. You have no hired hand, no family, and no way to cut timber with a lame mule. I have a saw. You have a cross-cut saw designed for 2 people. She met his eyes. "Then I will figure something else out." Merriweather put his hat on again, which meant the conversation was finished. I will come back before Thanksgiving. If you have not found a way by then, I will drive you to the county seat myself. That is not a threat. It is a promise I made to your husband when he was alive. He rode down the ridge road in the rain, and Randy stood in the woodshed door and counted the cords again. 1 3/4, maybe 1 1/2 if the green hickory burned as badly as she expected. She needed 6. The gap was not something she could close with effort alone, because effort required time, and the saw required 2 hands on the other end, and the mule could not drag, and the money was not enough to hire a man, even if a man were willing to work for a widow that half the settlement expected to fail. She went inside. The stove was burning well for once, and the cabin was warm enough that she could feel exactly where the warmth ended, at the north wall, where the cold pressed in through the cracked daubing like a hand laid flat against her back. Kavit did not follow her inside. She heard him at the back of the woodshed, scratching. He had been doing it for days now, clawing at the loose rock pile in the darkest corner where the shed floor met the limestone bluff. She had scolded him twice. He scattered stones across the packed earth and tracked limestone dust onto the bedding. She assumed he had found a groundhog burrow or a snake den, something that smelled alive and hidden and worth digging after. She called his name. He kept scratching. The trigger came 9 days later, on a morning when frost turned the cabin window to milk glass, and the water bucket beside the bed wore a skin of ice thick enough to crack with her knuckle. Randy had been managing. She cut deadfall with a hatchet. Slow, miserable work that produced armloads instead of cords, branches instead of logs. She had patched the worst chinking crack with a mix of clay, straw, and ash that held for 2 days before the stove's heat dried it, and the wind's pressure cracked it again. She had eaten beans for 9 straight days. The mule was no better. Kavit was the only creature on the ridge that seemed unbothered, and Kavit spent every evening in the woodshed, digging. That morning she went to scold him again. The woodshed was cold, but not as cold as outside Nas. The bluff sheltered it from the northwest wind, and the stacked wood acted as a rough wall. Kavit had pulled a dozen fist-sized rocks out of the corner and piled them behind him like a badger working a set. Limestone dust coated his paws and muzzle. Randy crouched to drag him out by the scruff, and she stopped. There were 2 water crocks in the woodshed. One sat near the outer wall, where she kept it for the mule. The other sat 3 feet from the corner where Kavit dug, shoved against the bluff stone. The outer crock had a skin of ice. The inner crock, the one near the dog's excavation, did not. The water was cold but liquid, clear and still. She put her hand on the stone above the dugout seam. It was cool, not cold. Cool the way her father's cellar walls in Wisconsin felt in November, holding something the surface had already lost. She pulled Kavit aside and knelt. The dog had opened a gap between 2 slabs of limestone, a dark seam no wider than her forearm, tilting back into the bluff at a shallow angle. She could feel air moving against her face, not wind, not a draft from outside, something steadier, something that came from inside the stone, and it carried a smell she recognized from her girlhood, damp mineral, old water on clean rock, the breath of underground. She held a candle to the seam. The flame leaned inward, drawn by the moving air, and then steadied. It did not gutter. It did not die. The air coming from inside the rock was not dead air, the kind that killed miners and filled wells with invisible poison. It was live air, moving through passages she could not see, entering the bluff from some opening higher on the ridge and flowing downward through the limestone, the way water flowed through the losing streams that disappeared into Ozark sinkholes every spring. Randy sat back on her heels. Kavit pressed his nose to the seam and whined. She knew what this was. The Ozarks were riddled with caves. Every farmer on the ridge had a story about sinkholes swallowing fence posts, springs appearing from nowhere, and cellars that broke through into passages running deeper than a lantern could reach. She had heard stories about saltpeter miners during the war, about lead diggings that opened into caverns wide enough to drive a wagon through. She had never thought about what those caverns felt like inside, but her father had taught her something that she had carried without knowing she was carrying it. Peter Solheim had pressed his palm flat against the wall of every root cellar he built and said the same thing. Stone remembers summer longer than wood. A cellar 3 feet underground holds 50 degrees when the surface drops to zero because the earth around it changes temperature slowly, grudgingly, the way a cast iron skillet holds heat long after the stove goes cold. A cave, deeper than any cellar, surrounded by more stone than a man could move in a lifetime. A cave would hold its temperature the way a vault holds gold, not warm, not comfortable, but constant. And constant when the alternative was a cabin losing heat through every crack and seam in the wall might be enough. She did not say any of this aloud. She picked up the candle and looked at the seam and thought about the math. 1 3/4 cords against 6. A north wall that bled heat. A stove that could not outrun the loss. And behind the dog's mess of scattered stone, a breath of air that was 50 degrees in a world about to drop below zero. The idea was not a plan yet. It was a question. She asked it quietly to herself, in the cold woodshed with the dog's nose pressed to the dark. Could she live in there? Lottie Pierce came the next afternoon, uninvited, carrying a crock of sauerkraut, and the particular expression of a woman who has been told by her husband to check on the neighbor and intends to do it thoroughly. Lottie was 39, mother of 4, wife of Harlan Pierce, whose farm sat in the creek bottom a mile and a half below. She was practical the way a skinning knife is practical, useful, blunt, and not interested in feelings. She liked Randy well enough. She did not believe Randy would survive the winter. Meriwether told Harlan, "You have less than 2 cords," Lottie said, setting the sauerkraut on the table without ceremony. "He said the north wall is failing." "Meriwether is correct about the wall. He is close on the wood." "Then what are you doing about it?" Randy considered lying. She considered saying nothing. Instead, she said, "Come look at something." She led Lottie into the woodshed. The dog was already at the corner, tail moving slowly. Randy crouched and held the candle to the seam. The flame leaned in and held. Lottie watched. Her face did not change. Then she said, "That is a hole in a hill." "It is a passage. The air is moving. It is dry." "A hole in a hill is where water waits." Lottie straightened and folded her arms. "My uncle in Phelps County lost a mule down a sinkhole. They heard it screaming for 2 days before it stopped. Caves flood. Caves collapse. Things live in caves that do not live in houses, and there is a reason for that. The air is moving. A flooded passage does not move air. You do not know what is behind that stone. 10 feet in, there could be a drop. There could be a pool. There could be a passage so low you cannot turn around, and if your candle goes out, you will never find your way back to this corner." Randy nodded. She could not argue with any of it. Every word Lottie said was true. Caves did flood. Caves did collapse. The National Park Service posted warnings at every Ozark cave entrance for exactly the reasons Lottie described. Falls, drowning, bad air, unstable ceilings, animals, disorientation. The fact that the air moved did not prove the passage was safe. It proved only that the passage existed. "So test it," Randy said. "What?" "I will test it. I will mark the floor with flour to see if water crosses it after the next rain. I will set a candle at knee height and watch for an hour. I will tie a string from here to the first open space and measure the distance. I will not take the stove inside until I know the air can carry the smoke out." Lottie stared at her. "You are going to crawl into that. I am going to find out what is behind it. If it is a wet sinkhole, I will know. If it is a dry chamber with 50-degree air and solid ceiling, I will know that too. And if it is the second thing, Lottie, then I have something that 200 cords of firewood cannot give me. I have a place that does not lose heat." Lottie shook her head. She picked up the sauerkraut crock, which she had apparently decided to take back. Then she set it down again. "You are going to die in that hill, but you are going to die up here anyway, so I suppose it makes no difference which way you choose." She left the sauerkraut. Randy spent 3 days testing before she touched a single stone. She borrowed a ball of cotton twine from her sewing box and tied one end to a nail in the woodshed beam. She lit a tallow candle, lay flat on the packed earth, and pushed through the seam head first with the twine unspooling behind her and the candle held ahead in her right hand. The passage was tight for 6 feet. Her shoulders scraped limestone on both sides, and her breath came back warm against her face. The floor was dry, not damp clay, not standing water, but packed mineral earth with a fine grit that felt like sanded flour under her palms. The candle flame held steady. The air smelled of clean stone and something faintly metallic, the way well water tastes in iron country. Then the passage opened. She came through into a space where the candlelight no longer touched the walls. The ceiling lifted above her head. She could stand barely, with her hair brushing rough stone. The floor dropped slightly and leveled. She held the candle high and turned a slow circle. The chamber was roughly 9 feet wide and 14 feet deep, narrowing toward the back where a second passage continued into darkness. The walls were dry limestone, pale gray with seams of darker dolomite running through like veins in a wrist. The ceiling was solid, no loose flakes, no crumbling edges, no water stains. The air was still and cool and carried the particular silence of underground spaces, a silence so complete that she could hear her own pulse in her ears. She set the candle on the floor and placed her palm against the wall. 52 degrees. She did not have a thermometer with her, but she knew the feeling, the same temperature as her father's deepest cellar in October, the temperature that kept potatoes firm and apples crisp and cider from turning, the temperature of the earth itself, indifferent to the season above. She marked the floor with a thin line of flour across the widest point. She set a second candle at knee height near the back passage and left it burning. She backed out through the seam, unwinding the twine, and emerged into the woodshed with limestone dust in her hair and a feeling in her chest that she had not felt since Amos died. Not hope? Not yet. But the space where hope might fit if the tests held. The rain came 2 days later, a hard, driving rain that lasted 6 hours and turned the ridge trails to mud. She checked the chamber at dawn. The flour line was undisturbed. No water had crossed it. A small trickle ran along the base of the far wall, following the natural slope of the floor toward the second passage and disappearing. The candle she had left was burned to a stub, but had never gone out. The air was still moving. On the third day, she carried the mercury thermometer inside. 51 degrees. Outside, the morning air was 29. Word spread the way word always spread on the ridge, through Lottie Pierce, who told Harlan, who told the men at the crossroads, who told Pike. The version that reached Pike's store was this. The Brecka widow was digging into the hillside behind her woodshed because her dog found a hole. She was crawling into the rock like a mine rat. She had lost her mind from grief, and someone ought to do something before she got herself killed and left a mule and a dog and a $28 debt behind. Pike listened to this with the particular attention of a man calculating. He came to the ridge on a Tuesday, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, with a paper folded inside his coat that Randy could see the corner of when he shifted his weight. He did not bring the paper out. He was testing the ground first. Mrs. Brecka. He touched his hat. He did not remove it. I hear you are making improvements. I am. To the woodshed. To my property. Pike looked at the shed. The door was closed. She had closed it when she saw him on the trail, and Kivit stood between Pike and the door with his ears flat and a sound in his throat that was not quite a growl. Stone does not burn, Pike said. Wood does. You cannot heat a mountain, Mrs. Brecky. Whatever you think you have found in there, it will not replace 6 cords of oak. Winter does not care about clever ideas. Winter cares about fuel. You came to talk about my fuel supply? I came to talk about your account. He touched the paper in his coat. I have been patient. Your husband was a good man and a fair customer, but patience is not infinite, and your credit is. I told you I would not sign the timber rights. And I told you I cannot carry the note past Christmas. If you cannot pay, we will need to discuss other arrangements. His eyes moved to the shed door. What is behind that door? Firewood. Firewood, and what else? Firewood, Mr. Pike. And a dog that does not like visitors? Pike's jaw worked. He was not accustomed to being managed by anyone, least of all a woman who owed him money. He looked at the shed, at the dog, at the ridge above where the timber stood, and Randy could see him adding numbers in his head, the value of the timber, the cost of the taxes, the likelihood that she would fail, and the property would come to him at auction price. I will be back before Christmas, he said, with the note. He left. Randy opened the shed door and sat on the threshold with Kavit in her lap, and she looked at the seam in the corner, and she thought about what Pike would do if he knew what was behind it. He would claim the cave contained mineral deposits. He would file a lien. He would find some way to turn the only advantage she had into his own leverage, because that was what Pike did. He turned other people's bad luck into his inventory. She would not let him see it. Not yet. Not until she knew whether it could save her. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could only see the old way of surviving? The next morning, Randy began to widen the entrance. She worked with a hand sledge and a cold chisel that Amos had used for splitting shingle bolts. The limestone was layered, sedimentary beds that wanted to separate along horizontal planes if you hit them right. She learned this in the first hour, when a careless strike sent a slab sideways instead of inward and opened a gash across her left knuckle that bled onto the stone and did not stop for 20 minutes. She wrapped her hand in a strip torn from a worn-out shirt and kept working. The opening was 20 inches high and 14 inches wide when Kivit found it. She needed it at least 30 inches high and 22 wide, enough to pass through with bedding, a small stoveplate, and sacks of food. Every inch she widened meant pounds of rock, broken, lifted, and carried out to the pile behind the shed. Her shoulders burned, her back locked after 2 hours, and she had to lie flat on the shed floor until the muscles released. The chisel slipped twice more. Her hands looked like she had been fighting the stone with her bare fists. By the end of the first day, she had gained 4 inches of height and 3 of width. At this rate, she would need a week just to open the passage. She did not have a week to spare on the passage alone. She needed to frame the opening, build a door, arrange ventilation, move supplies inside, and solve the problem of heating the woodshed mouth without smoking the chamber, all before the real cold arrived. The weather was cooperating for now. November in the Ozarks was cold, but not killing. The nights dropped to the 20s. The days climbed back to the 40s, and the rain came often enough to keep the ground soft. But the old men at the crossroads were watching the sky and saying the words that every ridge settler learned to dread. Early winter. The persimmons had seeded heavy. The caterpillars were dark. The geese had gone south 3 weeks ahead of schedule. None of it was science. All of it was the accumulated observation of men who had watched Ozark weather for decades, and when they agreed, they were rarely wrong. Randy's hands split across both palms on the second day. She soaked them in warm salt water, wrapped them in grease-smeared cloth, and went back to the chisel. The limestone dust coated her hair, her clothes, her lungs when she breathed too close to the strike point. She tied a wet rag across her nose and mouth. She looked, she knew, like a woman who had lost her mind, exactly as Pike's store gossip described. She did not care what she looked like. She cared about the 4-inch gap between what she had opened and what she needed to fit through. She cared about the thermometer in the chamber reading 51 degrees, while the morning air outside read 26. She cared about the math that Meriwether had laid out in plain language: fuel for November, not winter. She had found something that did not need fuel. She just had to make the door wide enough to use it. On the third evening, as the light failed and her arms hung useless at her sides, she heard boots on the trail below the shed. She closed the door. She wiped the limestone dust from her face. She picked up the hatchet, not because she expected trouble, but because a woman alone on a ridge learned to hold something heavy when she heard boots she did not recognize. The boots belonged to a man she had never seen before. He was tall, thin, past 60, with a face weathered the color of old harness leather and hands that were missing the last 2 fingers on the left. He carried a short iron pry bar over one shoulder and a canvas sack that clinked with metal. "Mrs. Brecke?" he said. "Who's asking?" "Tollef Vangen. I came about a mule harness, but I think the harness can wait." He was looking at her hands, at the limestone dust on her sleeves, at the thin white powder caught in the creases of her knuckles, the kind of dust that only comes from working raw stone with steel tools. His eyes moved to the woodshed door, and she saw something change in his face. Not curiosity exactly, but recognition. The look of a man who knew what limestone dust meant because he had worn it himself. "You have been cutting into the bluff," he said. It was not a question. Randy tightened her grip on the hatchet and said nothing. Tollef set his pry bar on the ground, point down, and leaned on it the way another man might lean on a fence post. "I spent 11 years in the Lee diggings up near the Iowa line," he said, "and 4 years after that working saltpeter caves for the Confederates, though I had no love for their cause and less for their pay. I have opened more stone than most men have walked across." He looked at her hands again. "You are using a shingle chisel. It will work, but you will break your wrists before you break enough rock." Randy stared at him. The hatchet hung at her side. Kavit had come out of the shed and was sniffing Tollef's boots with the careful interest he reserved for people he had not yet decided about. "I heard at the crossroads that a woman on the ridge was asking questions about air moving through stone," Tollef said. "Most people ask about water. Water in caves, water in wells, water in sinkholes. Nobody asks about air unless they have found something breathing." The dog sat down beside Tollef's boot. That settled it. Randy opened the woodshed door. Tollef Vangen walked inside, looked at the seam, and crouched the way a man crouches beside something he has missed. He placed his right hand flat against the stone above the opening. He held it there for a long time. Then he brought the candle close and watched the flame lean inward and steady. "How deep does it go?" he asked. 9 feet wide, 14 deep. Solid ceiling, dry floor. Second passage continues back, but I have not followed it." "Temperature?" 51 on the thermometer. 52 the first time. Tollef looked at the opening she had widened. 24 inches high now, 17 wide. He looked at the chisel marks. He looked at the blood on the stone where her knuckle had opened. "You're doing this alone," he said. "I am." He nodded. He did not offer pity. He did not offer charity. He reached into his canvas sack and pulled out a short-handled mason's hammer with a chipped head and a tempered point. "This will cut faster than the chisel. You strike at the bed line, here where the layers separate. You do not fight the stone. You let the stone tell you where it wants to break." He pointed to a faint horizontal seam in the limestone. "The bluff has been telling you. You have not been listening." Randy took the hammer. It was lighter than the sledge, balanced differently, and when she struck the bed line where Tolliff pointed, a clean slab separated from the face and dropped to the floor in one piece. She looked at the slab. She looked at Tolliff. "I will come tomorrow," he said. "We will do the cribbing first. If you open more without shoring, the weight above will shift, and instead of a door, you will have a burial." He picked up his pry bar and his sack. At the woodshed door he stopped. "The harness parts," he said. "Do you have trace buckles?" "Amos kept some in the loft. I will look." "Good. I will bring oak staves for the uprights. We will trade." He walked down the trail in the failing light, and Randy stood in the woodshed with the mason's hammer in her split hands and the candle flame leaning into the dark, and for the first time since Amos died, the math changed. Not because the numbers were different, because someone who understood stone had looked at her work and decided it was worth finishing. Outside, the wind shifted north. The temperature, which had been 41 at noon, was 32 and falling. November was half gone. The old men at the crossroads had said early winter, and the caterpillars and the geese and the persimmons agreed. The stone behind the woodshed held at 51 degrees. It did not care what the wind did. It did not care what the men at the crossroads said. It held its own season, patient and indifferent, the way Randy's father had always said it would. But Tolliff had also said something else, something she turned over in her mind as she barred the shed door and went inside to heat beans on the smoking stove. If you open more without shoring, the weight above will shift. Instead of a door, you will have a burial. The cave could save her. It could also kill her. The difference was knowledge she did not yet have, being taught by a man she had met 20 minutes ago, on a timeline that the weather controlled and she did not. She ate the beans. She counted the money. $11.40. She counted the wood. 1 3/4 cords, minus what she had burned in the last 2 weeks. Call it 1.5. She needed 6. She had a quarter of what survival required, a hole in a hill that might be a refuge or a grave, a dog with bloody paws, and a stranger who knew how stone breaks. The wind hit the north wall and found the crack, and the cold came through. Tolliff came at first light with 2 white oak staves across his shoulder and a mule that walked better than Randy's. He did not waste daylight on talk. He leaned into the woodshed, studied the opening she had widened, and tapped the stone above it with the butt of his pry bar. 3 sharp raps, each in a different spot. He listened the way a doctor listens to a chest. Then he tapped the wall to the left, and the sound changed. Randy heard it too. A hollower note, thinner, as if the stone behind it was not seated. "There," Tolliff said. "That flake is hanging by its own weight. If you had hit it with the sledge from below, it would have come down on your head. 400 pounds, maybe more." He chalked an X on the wall. "Never strike above an X. That is the first rule. The second rule is that you tap before you strike, every time, even if you tap the same spot an hour ago. Stone shifts. Stone lies." He showed her how to build cribbing, a low timber frame fitted inside the widened entrance to hold the weight of the bluff above the gap. The 2 oak staves became uprights, set 3 inches inside the opening on either side, their tops notched to receive a cross lintel he cut from a hickory beam Amos had stored in the loft. The fit was tight. Tolliff drove oak wedges between the uprights and the stone until the frame could not move. He tested it by hanging his full weight from the lintel. It held. Now the stone above is resting on oak instead of itself, he said. Oak will complain before it breaks. Stone will not. Stone gives you silence, and then it gives you everything at once. They worked through the morning. Tolliff showed her how to strike the bed lines, the horizontal seams in the sedimentary limestone where the layers wanted to separate. He showed her how to use the pry bar to lever a slab free after cracking it rather than hammering until it shattered. Shattered stone meant sharp edges, flying chips, and wasted effort. A clean slab meant a building block. Save the flat ones, he said. You will want them for the threshold. By midday, the opening was 28 inches high and 21 inches wide. Randy's arms shook. Her left shoulder, which she had strained the day before, had stiffened into a knot that burned when she lifted the hammer above her waist. Tolliff watched her swing and said nothing for 20 minutes. Then he said, You are fighting the stone with your shoulder. Use your wrist. The hammer does the work. You're just telling it where. She adjusted. The next strike split a clean slab along the bedline, and the slab fell into her hands like a page torn from a book. Better, Tolliff said. It was the most praise she would hear from him for 3 weeks. They fell into a pattern. Tolliff came every morning at first light and left at dusk. He brought tools, a second pry bar, a mason's chisel with a proper guard, a hand drill for pinholes, and she traded what she had: harness buckles, a set of farrier's nippers. Amos no longer needed a wool blanket she could not spare but offered anyway. Tolliff refused the blanket. He said he had enough blankets and not enough buckles, and that was the end of it. The entrance reached 30 inches high and 22 inches wide on the 4th day. Wide enough. Tolliff declared it finished and turned his attention to the chamber itself. He went inside first, crawling through with a candle in one hand and his pry bar in the other. Randy heard him tapping, the same systematic percussion he had used on the entrance, working the ceiling inch by inch, listening for the hollow note that meant a flake was loose. She heard 2 sharp cracks as he knocked hanging pieces free with the bar. When he came out, his hair was white with dust, and his expression was the closest thing to satisfaction she had seen on his face. The ceiling is sound past the entrance. 2 flakes near the front. I brought them down. The rest is seeded. You could put a team of mules in there and the roof would not notice. He wiped his face with his sleeve. The back passage drops about 2 feet after 14 feet and then continues. I did not go past the drop. The air is still moving, which means there is another opening somewhere higher on the ridge. That is your ventilation. Can I use a stove inside? No. The word was flat and final. Never open fire deep inside. The smoke will layer against the ceiling and fill the space. It has nowhere to go but through you. He drew a diagram in the dust of the woodshed floor with his finger. The stove stays here, in the woodshed mouth, near the outer wall. The pipe goes through the shed wall, same as now. The heat from the stove warms the shed. The warm air from the shed drifts through the entrance. The cave does not need fire. The cave needs the cold to stop stealing what the stove makes. Randy studied the diagram. The shed is not sealed. Wind comes through the stacked wood. Then you seal it. Clay and scrap boards on the wind side. Leave the side facing the cabin open enough for the stove to draw. You're building a warm room between the cold outside and the constant inside. The shed becomes your buffer. It was elegant. It was also more work than she had time for. She said so. Tolef looked at her with an expression she would come to know well, the patience of a man who has been underground and knows that hurry kills faster than cold. You have time if you stop trying to do everything in the order you think it should go. Seal the shed first, then frame the door, then move supplies. The chamber does not need improvement. The chamber has been ready for 10,000 years. It is the human part that needs work. November bled into December. The ridge changed. The oaks dropped their last brown leaves and stood bare against a sky that whitened and lowered every week. Frost came earlier and stayed later. The morning temperature on Randy's porch thermometer dropped from the high 20s to the low 20s to the teens. Each drop tightened the timeline by another day. Randy sealed the wind side of the woodshed with scrap boards, clay daubing, and a double layer of feed sacks nailed over the worst gaps. Tolef helped her hang a heavy canvas sheet as an interior partition, dividing the shed into a front section where the stove sat and a rear section where the cave entrance opened. The canvas trapped warm air on the cave side and let the stove draft from the front. She framed a plank door for the cave entrance, 3 boards of white oak, battened and hinged with leather strips, fitted tight enough to hold warmth, but loose enough to allow the cave's own air to circulate. Behind the door, she laid flat limestone slabs into a threshold, angled slightly outward so that any meltwater or rain seeping under the shed wall would run away from the chamber instead of into it. Inside the chamber, she built a sleeping platform from 2 sawhorses and a plank shelf, raising the bed 8 inches off the stone floor. Tolef insisted on this. Cold air sinks, warm air rises. You sleep on the floor, you sleep in the coldest air in the chamber. 8 inches makes the difference between discomfort and danger. She moved supplies in stages, quilts, the Goodwool blanket, a sack of beans, cornmeal, a sealed crock of sorghum, candles, matches, the water crock, a tin cup, a spoon, and the mercury thermometer. Each trip through the passage was a negotiation with her battered body. Stiff shoulder, split hands, knees bruised from crawling on stone. Kavit went through without complaint, his white coat picking up limestone dust until he looked like a ghost of himself. The physical cost accumulated. Randy lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her skirt hung loose at the waist. Her wrists, visible below her coat sleeves, had thinned. She ate beans and cornmeal and sorghum and tried not to count how many days each sack represented. The cornmeal would last until mid-January if she ate 1 meal a day. The beans would last longer. The sorghum was almost gone. She had spent $3 of the 11 on nails, clay pipe for the stove vent, and a small piece of tin to seal the pipe hole in the shed wall. $8.40 remained. The taxes were due in March. Pike's note was due at Christmas. She could not pay both. She could not pay either. Merriweather returned the week before Thanksgiving, as promised. He came on foot this time, the gelding having thrown a shoe. He walked the perimeter of the cabin again, and this time his route included the woodshed. Randy did not try to stop him. He had earned the right to see, and hiding it would cost her more in suspicion than showing it would cost in exposure. He stood inside the shed and looked at the framed entrance, the cribbing, the plank door, the sealed wind wall. He opened the cave door and held a candle inside. The flame leaned in and held steady. Warm air, relatively warm, 51 degrees against the 24-degree morning outside Dowars, breathed against his face. He closed the door and turned to Randy. "Who built the cribbing?" "I had help, a man named Tolef Vangen, the lead digger." "You know him?" "I know of him. He worked the Missouri mines before the war and the saltpeter caves during it. He is competent." Merriweather touched the oak upright, testing its fit. "The shoring is sound. The entrance is properly framed. The door is crude but functional. He paused. The chamber itself, is the ceiling examined? Tolliff tapped every inch. He removed 2 loose flakes. The rest is seated. Meriwether nodded slowly. He was not a man who admitted error in the same conversation where the error was revealed. He would need time. But something in his assessment had shifted. She could see it in the way he touched the cribbing a second time, the way his eyes followed the stovepipe path through the shed wall, the way he looked at the sealed wind wall with the feed sacks nailed over the boards. Warm is not safe, he said finally. You know that. I know it. If the ceiling drops, if a single slab comes loose in the night, there is no one to dig you out. If the passage floods, you drown in the dark. If the air turns bad, you will not know it until you cannot stand. The air moves. There is a second passage drawing from higher on the ridge. Tolliff confirmed it. Tolliff is not God. Passages block, ice dams form, rock shifts in deep cold. He put his hat on. I will not drive you to the county seat. You have done more than I expected, and I do not dismiss work that shows competence. But I will not tell you this is safe, because safe is not a word that applies to sleeping inside a hill. He left. Randy closed the shed door and leaned against it. Kavit pressed his nose to her hand. Meriwether had not said she would die. He had not repeated his offer to take her to the women's home. He had touched the cribbing twice. For Asa Meriwether, that was nearly an endorsement. The setback came on the 2nd of December in the form of water. A cold rain fell for 2 days, not the hard-driving rain that ran off the ridge, but a slow, steady rain that soaked the ground deep and turned the soil to saturated clay. On the morning of the 3rd day, Randy opened the cave door and found a finger-width stream running across the threshold, tracing the join between the limestone floor and the base of the shed wall. Her flour marks inside the chamber were untouched. The water was not coming from inside the cave. It was coming from above, surface runoff flowing along the base of the bluff, finding the gap between the shed wall and the stone, and running across the threshold toward the chamber entrance. If it reached the chamber in volume, the dry floor would become a wet floor, wet bedding, ruined cornmeal, a sleeping platform standing in a shallow pool. Everything she had built would be compromised not by the cave's failure, but by the shed's. She sent Kavit to find Tolliff. The dog had learned the trail to the old man's shack 2 miles east, and he went without hesitation, barking at the door until Tolliff followed him back. Tolliff looked at the water. He knelt and traced its path with his finger. Then he went outside and walked the base of the bluff above the shed, reading the slope the way Randy read a stove's draft, contract by watching where things went when they moved. The runoff follows the bluff face, he said. Your shed sits in its path. You need a diversion trench, here, outside the shed wall, cut into the soil at an angle that sends the water past the corner and down the slope. Inside, you cut a shallow channel across the threshold, 6 inches wide, sloping toward the side wall. Any water that gets past the trench hits the channel and drains out through a weep hole at the base. They dug the trench in freezing rain. The soil was heavy clay, stubborn and cold, and the shovel handle raised blisters on top of Randy's existing calluses. Tolliff worked beside her without complaint, his breath steaming, his 3-fingered left hand gripping the pick handle with a grip that had not weakened in 61 years. Inside the shed, they chiseled a drainage channel across the threshold stone, shallow enough not to trip over, deep enough to catch a runoff stream. Tolliff punched a weep hole through the side wall with the hand drill angled downward and packed the edges with clay to keep wind from entering. By nightfall, the diversion worked. The runoff followed the trench past the shed corner and down the slope. The threshold channel caught the residual seep and sent it out through the weep hole. The chamber floor remained dry, but the day was lost. A full day of construction time spent fixing a problem that should not have existed, and the sky above the ridge was the color of lead, and the old men at the crossroads were no longer saying early winter. They were saying soon. Pike sent a boy to watch the property. Randy noticed him on a Thursday, a thin kid of about 14, sitting on a stump across the hollow with a cold biscuit and a clear view of the woodshed door. He was there the next day, too, and the day after that. He never came closer. He never spoke. He just watched, and at dusk he walked down toward the store road. Tolliff saw the boy and said nothing for a full day. Then he said, "Pike is counting your trips to the shed. He wants to know what you're carrying inside. If the boy reports tools and supplies going through a door in the back wall, Pike will come with questions you cannot answer without showing him." "I know." "You could stop working until the boy loses interest." "I do not have time to stop." Tolliff nodded. "Then we disguise the work. Supplies go in at night after the boy leaves. During the day, you work the visible side, patching, chinking, stacking wood, mending the porch rail. The shed door stays closed when the boy is watching. He sees a widow doing widow's work. He reports nothing worth Pike's attention." "It was a strategy born of the mines," Tolliff said. "Underground, you learned that what the bosses saw mattered more than what you did. You could shore a dangerous passage on your own time, but if the boss saw you shoring instead of digging, he counted it as idleness. So you shored at night and dug during the day, and the passage held and the boss was satisfied, and both things were true at once. They worked the deception for a week. During daylight, Randy patched chinking, restacked the woodpile to look fuller, and made visible trips to the creek for water. After dark, she and Tolliff carried the last supplies through the cave entrance by candlelight. The water crock, the reserve candles, a second quilt Lottie Pierce had brought without explanation, and a small iron stove plate that Tolliff had pulled from a ruined cabin 3 miles east and carried on his back. Lottie's quilt arrived with a note pinned to the corner in blunt pencil. "I still think it is madness, but madness ought to have a dry blanket." It was the second time Lottie had said something like that, and Randy folded the quilt into the chamber with a feeling that cracked something in her chest that she had been holding rigid since Amos died. By the last week of January, the chamber was ready. 9 feet wide, 14 feet deep, dry limestone floor, solid ceiling confirmed by Tolliff's systematic tapping, sleeping platform 8 inches off the floor, quilts and blankets layered, the good wool blanket on top, beans, cornmeal, sorghum in sealed crocks along the side wall. Water crock filled daily from the creek, candles, matches, tin cup, spoon. The mercury thermometer hung from a nail in the wall at shoulder height. Kavitz bedding, a folded feed sack, at the foot of the platform. The stove sat in the woodshed mouth, its pipe angled through the shed wall and sealed with clay and the scrap tin. The canvas partition divided the shed into the stove side and the cave side. The plank door sealed the cave entrance. The diversion trench and threshold channel handled runoff. The weep hole drained. The second exit, a narrow crawl vent Tolliff had insisted on cutting through the shed's side wall, low to the ground, covered with a hinged board, provided emergency egress if the main shed door froze shut or collapsed under snow load. "You must be able to leave even if everything above you fails," Tolliff said when he cut the vent. "A single exit is a trap. 2 exits is a choice. That is the difference between a shelter and a coffin." On a night when the cabin temperature dropped to 28 degrees near the failing north wall, Randy checked the cave thermometer. 51 degrees. She checked again at dawn. 53. The butter she had placed on the shelf was firm, but not frozen. The water crock was clear and liquid. Kavit slept on his feed sack without shivering, his breathing slow and even, his paws finally healing from the weeks of digging that had started everything. Meriwether's voice played in her head. Warm is not safe. And he was right. Warm was not safe. But Warm was alive, and alive was what she intended to stay. The telegraph message reached the Crossroads store on the 1st of February. Arctic high pressure descending from Manitoba, expected to reach the Central Plains by the 4th. Temperatures forecast to drop 40 to 60 degrees in 12 to 18 hours. Wind speeds dangerous. Livestock warning. Travel warning. The language was the clipped shorthand of a government weather office speaking to people who understood what the words meant without elaboration. The sky confirmed it. The blue hardened. The clouds vanished. The air went still in a way that felt less like calm and more like the world holding its breath. Chickens stopped scratching the yard and stood motionless near the coop wall. The mule, lame and old and usually indifferent, pressed herself against the south side of the pen and would not move. Pike raised prices on lamp oil. He raised prices on nails. He sold the last kerosene in his stock to 3 families in a single afternoon and closed the store early. The ridge emptied, doors shut, shutters fastened. Chimneys smoked as people built fires they intended to keep burning for as long as the wood held out. Randy filled the water crocks, one in the cabin, one in the cave. She stacked the stove box full and laid extra wood within arm's reach. She checked the cave door, the canvas partition, the weep hole, the second exit. She hung the thermometer on the shed wall so she could track both temperatures, Yalne's inside the shed and inside the cave, without going outside. Tolliff came by at dusk and checked the stovepipe seal. He tightened the clay around the tin plate where the pipe passed through the wall. He checked the diversion trench, which was dry. He checked the emergency crawl vent, opening and closing the hinged board twice. "The front will come before dawn," he said. "The wind will hit from the north. Your cabin will lose temperature fast. That north wall has never been right. Stay in the shed. Keep the stove running. Sleep in the chamber." "Where will you be?" "My shack is banked with earth on 3 sides. I will be fine." He paused. "If the stovepipe ices, if the draft reverses and smoke comes inside, open the front vent and the crawl vent at the same time. Cross draft will clear it. Do not try to fix the pipe in the wind. You will lose your hands." He left. Randy barred the shed door and the cabin door and sat on the cabin bed with Kavit beside her and watched the light die through the west window. The sunset was red and hard, the kind of red that looked like the sky was bleeding out. She did not sleep. She listened. The wind hit at 4 in the morning. It did not build. It arrived, a single sustained roar from the north that struck the cabin like a fist and did not stop. The stove flue shuddered. The north wall cracked along the old chinking line, and a thread of air came through that was so cold it felt wet. Randy pressed her hand to the wall. The interior surface, which had been cool but bearable an hour ago, was now cold enough to hurt. She moved to the woodshed. She fed the stove until the firebox glowed, and the heat pushed into the shed and pressed against the sealed wind wall and the canvas partition. And behind the partition, the cave door breathed its steady 52 degrees into the space between. The shed held. For the first hour, the shed held. The porch thermometer was unreadable in the dark, but by the sound of the wind and the speed at which the cabin walls surrendered their heat, Randy knew this was not ordinary cold. This was the kind of cold the old men described but had not seen in years, the kind that cracked trees, killed cattle standing up, and turned a man's breath to ice on his own beard before it left his face. At dawn, though dawn was only a gray lightning of the dark, the sun hidden behind a sky scoured white by wind-driven ice crystals, she checked the cabin thermometer. 22 degrees inside. The water pail beside the bed had a skin of ice. The north wall was frosted on the interior surface. She could see her breath in the cabin, and the stove in the other room was burning as hot as she could make it. She checked the cave thermometer. 52 degrees. The gap was 30 degrees and widening. By mid-morning, the wind had not stopped. It came in waves, a sustained roar punctuated by gusts that shook the shed wall hard enough to rattle the nails. Snow began, not falling, driving, horizontal. White streaks that hit the south-facing surfaces and stuck, building a crust of ice and packed snow that sealed gaps but also sealed the world. Randy moved between the stove mouth and the cave entrance every 30 minutes. Feed the stove. Check the pipe for ice. Check the draft. Check the cave temperature. Return. The rhythm was Tolif's teaching. He had drilled it into her during the construction weeks. Do not sit. Do not wait. Move on a schedule. The schedule keeps you alive because it keeps you measuring, and measuring keeps you ahead of the failure that kills you. At 11 in the morning, someone pounded on the shed door. She opened it into a wall of wind that drove ice crystals into her face like sand. On the step stood a boy, not Pike's spy, smaller, younger, with a face she recognized. Wade Pierce, Lottie's youngest, 9 years old. His coat was crusted with ice. His mittens were frozen solid, and when she pulled them off, his fingers were white and stiff. His eyelashes had frozen shut. He was shaking so hard he could not speak. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because this is the moment her secret stops being shelter and becomes a choice. She pulled him inside. The shed was warm, 40 degrees, maybe 45 near the stove. But Wade needed more than warm. His fingers were frostbitten, his lips were blue. He had been walking, she learned later, for 30 minutes in the open, sent by Harlan to find help after the Pierce chimney cracked at the mortar joint and began pouring smoke into the house faster than the fire produced heat. Lottie and Harlan were trapped, choosing between smoke and cold, stuffing rags into the crack while the temperature dropped around them. Wade could not walk back. He could barely stand. Randy made the decision in the time it took to look at his hands and understand what the white fingers meant. She picked him up. He weighed almost nothing, light as a feed sack, light as a child who had not eaten enough this winter, and she carried him through the canvas partition, opened the plank door, and brought him into the cave. The warmth hit them both. Not heat. 52 degrees is not heat, but compared to the shed, compared to the wind outside, compared to the frozen world above, it felt like stepping into a room where someone had been breathing for hours. The air was still. The wind, which had been a constant roar for 7 hours, was gone. Not muffled. Gone. The silence was so complete that Wade stopped shaking for a moment, not because he was warm yet, but because the absence of wind was so startling that his body forgot to tremble. Randy laid him on the sleeping platform. She wrapped him in the quilts, both of them, Lottie's donated quilt on the outside. She placed Cavit against his legs. The dog pressed close without being told, his body heat working against the boy's frozen trousers. She went back to the stove, heated 2 flat stones in the firebox until they were too hot to hold, wrapped them in cloth, and brought them through. She placed one against Wade's ribs and one against the soles of his feet. His breathing steadied. His shaking continued but changed, less violent, more rhythmic, the body's furnace relighting instead of failing. His fingers began to pink. The white retreated from the tips slowly, painfully, and when it did, He cried out because the blood returning to frostbitten fingers is one of the worst pains a body can produce. And he was 9 years old and did not understand why warming up hurt more than freezing. Randy held his hands between hers and talked to him. She told him about the cave. She told him the temperature was 52 degrees and would stay 52 degrees no matter what the wind did. She told him about Kavit digging at the corner, about the loose stones, about the candle flame leaning in. She told him things she had not told anyone because he was a child in pain, and children in pain need voices more than silence. The stovepipe iced at 1 in the afternoon. She heard the draft change, a hesitation in the stove's breathing, then a back puff of smoke through the firebox door. She went to the shed and saw gray haze layering against the ceiling. The pipe where it passed through the wall was glazed with ice, moisture from the combustion freezing on the cold exterior surface and building a crust that narrowed the flue opening. The draft was dying. Tolef's instruction came back whole. Open the front vent and the crawl vent at the same time. Cross draft will clear it. Do not try to fix the pipe in the wind. She opened the front shed vent, a board she could swing aside near the top of the wall. She opened the crawl vent at the base of the side wall. The cross draft hit immediately, a river of freezing air that cut through the shed like a blade. The smoke moved. It swirled, eddied, found the path of least resistance, and poured out through the front vent instead of backing up through the firebox. The draft in the stovepipe resumed, weakly, fighting the ice crust, but flowing. She could not leave both vents open. The cross draft dropped the shed temperature toward freezing in minutes. She closed the crawl vent, kept the front vent cracked, and added wood to the stove until the firebox roared, and the increased heat in the pipe began melting the ice from inside. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of managing airflow, reading smoke, adjusting vents, feeding fire. All of it Tolef's teaching. All of it learned in the construction weeks when she had not known she was being trained for this exact emergency. Behind the plank door, the cave held at 52 degrees. It did not know about the pipe. It did not care about the wind. Wade slept. Tolef arrived at 3 in the afternoon, walking into the wind from the east, half blinded by ice, his coat frozen stiff and his pry bar used as a walking staff. He had come because he feared the stovepipe would ice, and it had, and he found Randy managing exactly as he had taught her. He saw Wade on the platform. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How long has he been warm?" 4 hours, his fingers pinked. He slept an hour ago. Tolef nodded. He checked the cave entrance. Smoke eddied near the top of the doorway. Not much, but enough. The stove's draft was pulling cave air through the entrance, and the return flow carried traces of smoke into the upper inches of the opening. "Hang a wet blanket across the top third of the door," he said. "The smoke rides the ceiling, the blanket catches it. Clean air comes through the bottom 2/3. The boy breathes at bed level, not ceiling level." Randy soaked a feed sack in the water crock and draped it across the top of the doorway, pinning it with nails. The smoke trace vanished from the chamber. The air at bed level tested clean. She held the candle there, and the flame burned steady and bright. No flicker, no lean toward bad air. They settled into the rhythm of the crisis. Tolef took the stove watch, feeding the firebox, monitoring the pipe, managing the vents. Randy checked Wade every 30 minutes, rotated the hot stones, kept the water crock from freezing by setting it near the cave entrance where the shed's warmth reached. Kavit moved between them, lying with Wade when Wade was cold, sitting beside the stove when Randy was at the stove, his white coat ghost pale in the candlelight. The porch thermometer, which Tolef checked at dusk by holding a candle to it through a crack in the shed door, read 48 degrees below zero. The number was meaningless in its precision. The thermometer was old, the mercury may have been sluggish, and the wind chill made the effective temperature worse than any mercury could measure. But the number landed in the gut the way numbers do when they confirm what the body already knows. This was cold that killed. Outside on the ridge and in the hollows below, the cold was doing what cold does when it reaches past endurance. Meriwether's cattle shed, a post and beam structure he had maintained for 20 years, collapsed under the weight of wind-driven ice on the ridgepole. He lost 4 head. He saved the rest by driving them into the lee of his barn, which held because it was banked with earth on the north side. The same principle Randy was using. He would think about that later. Hiram Cale, a bachelor who lived alone on the South Fork Trail, survived because his nearest neighbor broke through a snowdrift to check on him and found him sitting in a dark cabin with a dead stove, his fingers and toes already white. They carried him to their house and saved his hands, but not 2 toes on his right foot. A man whose name Randy never learned, a ridge settler who lived past the head of the creek, died in his cabin with every crack sealed. He had stuffed rags into every gap, every chink, every window frame, and every stove joint to keep the cold out. The stove, starved of draft, burned incompletely. The carbon monoxide built in the sealed room. He died in his sleep, warm and poisoned, and they did not find him for 4 days. The ventilation that Tolef had insisted on, the crawl vent, the front vent, the moving air from the cave itself, was the reason Randy and Wade breathed clean air through the night. The sealed cabin across the ridge was the reason someone did not. The difference was not courage or luck. It was knowledge applied at the right moment in the right way. The wind died at dawn on the 2nd day. The silence woke Randy. She had slept sitting up in the shed, her back against the stove's warm wall, and when the roar stopped, the absence of sound was so sudden that she thought for a moment she had gone deaf. Then she heard Kavit's tail thumping against the platform inside the cave, and she heard Wade coughing, a healthy cough, a living cough, the sound of a chest clearing itself after too many hours of still air. She opened the shed door. The world was white and blue and still. The temperature on the porch thermometer read 11 degrees below zero, still dangerous, still brutal, but the wind was gone, and without wind the cold was endurable. The sun came up behind a sky so clear it looked like the inside of a blue glass bottle, and the light on the snow was blinding. Inside the cave, the thermometer read 52 degrees. It had not moved. 2 days of the worst cold the ridge had seen in a decade, and the stone had not flinched. It held its season the way it had held it for 10,000 years, indifferent to the wind, indifferent to the death above, indifferent to everything except the slow, deep rhythm of the earth's own warmth. Wade sat up on the platform. His fingers were pink. His toes, which Randy had checked twice in the night, were bruised but alive. He looked around the cave with the wide eyes of a child who has woken in a place he does not understand, and he said, "It is warm in here." "It is," Randy said. "How?" "The stone remembers summer," she said. The words came out in her father's voice, and she did not correct them. Tolef, who had slept on the shed floor with his coat as a blanket and his pry bar within reach, stood in the cave entrance and looked at the thermometer. 52 degrees. He looked at the sleeping platform, the quilts, the water crock still liquid, the candle burning steady. He looked at Randy. "It held," he said. "It held." He nodded once and went to feed the stove. The crisis was over. The questions that came next, who would come, what they would say, what Pike would do, what Meriwether would admit, those were problems for a world that had thawed enough to hold them. For now, the stove needed wood, and the boy needed food, and the dog needed to go outside, and the sun was up, and they were alive. The cave had done what the cabin could not. It had done what 6 cords of oak could not. It had not heated her. It had simply refused to let the cold in. That was enough. That had always been enough. She had just needed to find the door. Merriweather came the morning after the wind stopped, expecting to find a body. He brought a shovel. He brought a canvas tarp of the kind used to wrap the dead when the ground is too frozen to dig. He tied his horse at the trailhead and walked the last quarter-mile because the snow was too deep for hooves, and he came around the corner of the cabin with the tarp over one shoulder and the shovel in his right hand, and the expression of a man completing a duty he had promised a dead husband he would fulfill. The chimney was smoking. That was the first thing he noticed. The stovepipe through the shed wall had a thin column of gray rising into the still air, and smoke meant fire, and fire meant someone was feeding it. He set the shovel against the cabin wall. He folded the tarp and placed it on the porch rail. He knocked. Randy opened the shed door. Behind her, Merriweather could see the canvas partition, the glow of the stove, and beyond the partition, the plank door standing open. Warm air breathed out of the opening, not hot, not steaming, but perceptibly warmer than the 11 below morning outside. Kavit sat in the doorway with his tail moving and his coat dusted white with limestone. Wade Pierce sat on the sleeping platform inside the cave, eating cornmeal mush from a tin cup. His fingers were pink. His cheeks had color. He looked up at Merriweather with the uncomplicated expression of a child who has been warm and fed and does not yet understand how remarkable that is. Merriweather stood in the cave entrance for a long time. He did not speak. He placed his bare hand on the wall, the same gesture Randy had seen her father make 100 times in Wisconsin, palm flat, fingers spread, reading the stone's temperature through skin. He held it there. His face changed, not dramatically. Merriweather was not a man whose face moved easily, but something behind his eyes shifted, the way a surveyor's needle shifts when the compass finds true north after spinning. "What does it read?" he asked, looking at the thermometer. 52. It has not moved since October. He took his hand off the wall. He looked at the sleeping platform, the quilts, the sealed crocks, the water that had not frozen, the candle burning, steady in air that moved but did not gust. He looked at the cribbed entrance, the plank door, the threshold with its drainage channel. He looked at all of it the way he had once looked at quartermaster supply lines, assessing not just what was there but how it connected, how each element served the whole. "I measured winter wrong," he said. Randy waited. "I counted cords, I counted chinking, I counted stove capacity and wall thickness and roof pitch. I measured everything that makes heat and nothing that keeps it." He touched the wall again, briefly, as if confirming what his hand had already told him. "You did not outheat the cold. You stopped the cold from taking what you had. Tolef taught me. Tolef taught you the method. The idea was yours, or your father's, or the dog's." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the closest Merriweather came. "I owe you an apology. I told you that you had wood for November, not winter. I was wrong. You had stone for every winter this ridge will ever see." He picked up Wade and carried him to the horse. He would take the boy home to Lottie and Harlan, whose chimney crack had been patched with clay and scrap iron by a neighbor during the storm's lull. Before he left, he turned back. "I will send people to you," he said, "not to help, to learn." They came in ones and twos over the following week as the snow compacted and the trails reopened and the settlement began to take stock of what the Blue Norther had cost. The cost was specific. 1 man dead of carbon monoxide in a sealed cabin. Hiram Cale's 2 toes. gone to frostbite. 14 head of cattle lost across 4 farms. 3 chimneys cracked. 2 roofs partially collapsed under ice load. Dozens of cord feet of firewood burned through in 2 days. Wood that families had planned to stretch through March, gone in a single emergency, leaving them short for the rest of winter with no way to cut more until the ground thawed. Randy's woodpile told a different story. She had burned less than half a cord during the entire crisis. The stove had run at moderate intensity, enough to warm the shed buffer, not enough to heat a full cabin. The cave had done the rest. Where her neighbors had fought the cold with fire, pouring fuel into a losing battle against thin walls and leaking chinks, Randy had stepped behind the cold's reach entirely. The stone did not fight the winter. It ignored it. Lottie Pierce came first. She came without her husband, which meant she came for herself. She stood in the cave entrance and looked at the chamber where her son had slept and said nothing for a full minute. Then she said, "Show me." Randy showed her. Not the cave itself. Lottie could see that. She showed her the thinking behind it. She took a candle and held it at the entrance, showing how the flame leaned inward, proving the air moved. She pointed to the flour marks on the floor, undisturbed by water. She showed the drainage channel, the weep hole, the threshold slope. She showed the wet blanket across the top of the doorway where smoke had eddied. She showed the thermometer, 52 degrees, the same as it had been in October, the same as it would be in July. "The cave does not heat you," Randy said. "The cave stops the world from stealing your heat. Your body makes heat. Your blankets hold it. The stone holds the air still and cool instead of freezing. The difference between 52 degrees and 20 below zero is the difference between sleeping and dying. But 52 degrees does not cost a single stick of wood." Lottie listened the way she did everything, with her arms folded and her jaw set and her eyes missing nothing. When Randy finished, Lottie said, "We do not have a cave. You have a root cellar. The root cellar floods every spring." "Then your root cellar needs what this cave has: a drainage trench, a threshold slope, a vent for air, and walls that you stop treating like a hole in the ground and start treating like a room." Randy knelt and drew in the dust with her finger, the way Tolef had drawn for her. "Your cellar is 3 feet underground. The earth around it is warmer than the air above. If you seal the gaps, drain the water, and sleep below ground level during the worst nights, you will burn half the wood and lose none of the warmth." Lottie stared at the diagram. Then she unfolded her arms, the first time Randy had seen her do that in conversation, and said, "Draw it again, slower." Marta Keel came next, a German widow of 53 who farmed alone on the South Fork after her husband died of typhoid. She spoke careful English and kept her opinions behind a face that gave nothing away. She had survived the Blue Norther in her cabin by burning her porch railing, her spare chair, and half a door frame because her woodpile had run out on the second day. She did not ask for explanations. She asked for measurements. How deep was the cave? How wide was the entrance? What was the ceiling height? What was the floor composition? What was the temperature at floor level versus shoulder level? She wrote everything down in a small notebook with a pencil stub, and when she left, she said, "I will modify my cellar, if you will inspect it when I'm finished." "I will," Randy said. Eli Hoagland came third, a young woman of 24 who taught at the Ridge Schoolhouse and who had spent the Blue Norther in the school building with no heat source except a cast iron box stove that consumed wood faster than she could feed it. She had kept 2 students overnight when the storm trapped them, and she had burned every piece of spare furniture in the building to keep the temperature above freezing. Eli did not want to protect herself. She wanted to protect the students. If a storm traps them again, I need a space that holds warmth without consuming the school's entire woodpile in a single night. Can the principal work without a cave? Randy thought about it. She had been thinking about it since Lottie's visit, the question of how the cave's principle extended to people who did not have caves. The answer was not a single technique, it was a way of thinking. The principle is heat loss, Randy said. Every cabin on this ridge makes heat the same way, with a stove, but every cabin loses heat differently. Thin walls lose fast, thick walls lose slow, cracks lose faster than solid wood. North-facing walls lose faster than south. The floor loses to the ground, the ceiling loses to the roof. A big room loses more than a small room because there is more surface for the cold to steal through. She drew another diagram, this time on a plank, with chalk. You do not need a cave. You need a small room inside a big room. Build a partition in the school. Close off the corner nearest the stove. Hang quilts from the ceiling to the floor. Put the children inside the quilted space. The stove heats the school. The quilted corner traps the heat around the children. You are not heating the whole building. You are heating the space where the bodies are. The rest of the building can freeze. The children will not. Eli copied the diagram into her lesson book. She asked 4 more questions, each more specific than the last. Randy answered all of them. When Eli left, she shook Randy's hand, which was not common between women on the ridge, and which Randy understood as something more than gratitude. Pike did not come to learn. Pike came on a Tuesday in mid-February with a different paper in his coat, not the debt note this time, but something he had obtained from the county assessor's office. He stood in the yard and did not ask to enter. Mrs. Breck, I have been informed that your property may contain a natural cavern of unassessed extent. Under county ordinance, subsurface mineral features must be declared and assessed for potential mineral value. If the cavern contains marketable deposits, lead, saltpeter, calciumite, or other extractable materials, the assessment changes the tax basis of the claim. Randy stood on the porch with Kavit at her ankle. She let Pike finish. If the assessment reveals mineral value, the taxes on the claim will increase. If you cannot pay the increased assessment, the property enters tax delinquency. If the property enters tax delinquency, it goes to public auction. Pike paused. He was not threatening. He was explaining with the careful patience of a man who knows the law works for him if he works it correctly. I'm telling you this as a courtesy. You're telling me this as a warning. I'm telling you this as a man who holds your note and has an interest in seeing the property properly managed. Meriwether's voice came from behind the cabin. He had been walking the ridge, checking on the neighbors he had sent to Randy, and he had arrived without Pike noticing. He came around the corner with his coat open and his hands in his pockets, and the expression of a man who has heard enough. The cavern does not contain mineral deposits, Meriwether said. It is dry limestone and dolomite. I have seen it myself. There is no lead. There is no saltpeter. There is nothing in that cave worth mining, and you know it, Judson, because if there were, you would have filed a claim yourself instead of trying to raise her taxes. Pike's jaw tightened. I'm following county procedure. You are following your own interest and calling it procedure. This woman survived the worst cold this ridge has seen in a decade, saved a neighbor's child, and is teaching half the settlement how to keep their families alive. You are standing in her yard threatening her with a tax reassessment because her success inconveniences your ledger. The silence lasted long enough for Kavit to yawn. I hold the note, Pike said. The note is due. The note will be paid, Randy said. I have until Christmas, and Christmas is 10 months away. You gave me that term yourself. Pike folded the paper back into his coat. He looked at Meriwether. He looked at Randy. He calculated. Randy could see it happening behind his eyes. the same addition and subtraction he performed on every transaction, and he decided that this was not the day. There would be other days. He turned and walked down the trail without touching his hat. Meriwether watched him go. Then he turned to Randy. He will not stop. I know. He wants the ridge. Not just your timber, the ridge. If the cave becomes known as a place of value, he will find a way to claim it or price you off it. Then I need to pay the note before he finds the way. Meriwether nodded. He did not offer money. He did not offer advice. He offered something more useful. I will tell people what I saw, not just the cave. What you know, what you can teach. There are families on this ridge who will pay for the knowledge that keeps their children alive. He left. Randy sat on the porch in the cold sunlight with the dog and thought about what Meriwether had offered. Not charity, recognition. The most respected winter hand on the ridge had just told her that what she knew was worth paying for. That was not money in her hand, but it was the first step toward money, and money was what stood between her and Pike's ledger. Tolliff came every day through February and into March. The crisis had changed their work from urgent construction to systematic exploration. They were no longer building a survival shelter. They were mapping what the bluff contained. The first 100 feet of passage beyond the main chamber angled downward through a narrow corridor, widened into a second room roughly 6 feet across, narrowed again, and then opened into a third space that neither of them could see the far wall of by candlelight. The air moved steadily throughout, entering from somewhere higher on the ridge, flowing through the passages, and exiting through the woodshed entrance. The temperature held between 51 and 53 degrees at every point they measured. Tolliff taught Randy to mark safe routes with lamp-black arrows on the cave wall, a miner's technique that worked because lamp-black bonded with limestone and did not wash off or fade. He taught her to leave string lines tied to iron nails driven into wall cracks, so that if a candle failed, she could follow the string back to the entrance by touch. He taught her to count her steps and sketch the passages in a notebook, building a map that grew with each expedition. She taught him her father's root cellar methods, how Peter Solheim had tested walls for moisture by pressing dry cloth against the stone and checking for dampness after an hour, how he had used whitewash mixed with salt to seal porous surfaces, how he had angled cellar floors toward a central drain so that any seep collected in one place instead of spreading across the entire floor. Tolliff listened to these techniques with the careful attention of a man who recognized knowledge earned through generations of practice. He did not dismiss her father's methods because they came from a root cellar builder instead of a mine engineer. He adapted them. The whitewash and salt seal, he said, would work on the cave walls near the entrance where moisture from the shed sometimes dampened the stone. The angled floor principle, he said, was exactly what they had built with the drainage channel, but Peter Solheim had understood it 50 years before Tolliff did. Your father was a caveman who never saw a cave, Tolliff said one afternoon. They were sitting in the second chamber, resting, sharing a cold biscuit. He understood that stone holds what the surface loses. He built small rooms underground because he knew the earth keeps its own season. The only difference between his cellars and this, he gestured at the limestone ceiling above them, is that God dug this one and your father dug his. The relationship had changed. It was no longer teacher and student, it was partnership. Two people with different knowledge working the same problem. Tolliff had the miner's understanding of stone, how it broke, how it held, how it breathed, how it killed. Randy had the cellar builder's understanding of living underground, how to keep food, how to manage moisture, how to make a cold room habitable, how to think about heat not as something you created, but as something you protected. They disagreed once, sharply, about the back passage. Tolliff wanted to explore it to its end, to find the upper opening where the air entered, to map the full system, to understand the cave as a miner understood a mine. Randy wanted to leave it alone. The back passage was narrow, the footing was uncertain, and she did not need to know where the air came from to use what the air gave her. "You are afraid of what you do not know," Tolliff said. "I am careful about what I do not need." A miner who does not map the full passage does not understand the passage, and a passage you do not understand will surprise you. A widow who crawls into a hole she cannot get out of does not survive to use the hole. I will map it when I have rope, a second lamp, and someone waiting at this end who knows how long I have been gone. Tolliff looked at her. His expression shifted. Not anger, not concession, but the particular look of a man recognizing that the person he taught has developed judgment of her own. He nodded once and did not raise it again. The thaw came in late March, and it brought the test Randy had not planned for. 3 days of warm rain on frozen ground turned the ridge into a network of running water. Every gully, every crease in the hillside, every low spot became a channel. Root cellars across the settlement flooded. The Pierces lost a winter's worth of stored potatoes when their cellar filled to knee depth overnight. Marta Keel's modified cellar, the one she had rebuilt using Randy's drainage principles, held. The trench she had dug diverted the surface runoff. The threshold slope kept the interior dry. Her potatoes survived. The contrast was visible enough that 3 more families came to Randy within the week asking for instructions. But the test went deeper than drainage. A woman named Clara Strand, 26, 7 months pregnant, lived on the lower road with a husband who had gone to the lead mines in January and not returned. She developed a fever in the second week of the thaw, not the mild aches of a spring cold, but a hard, climbing fever that left her unable to stand and shaking under every blanket she owned. Her cabin was damp from the thaw, the roof leaked in 2 places, and the temperature swung between the 40s during the day and the 20s at night. The swings were worse than steady cold. A sick body needs stability. Clara's cabin gave her nothing steady. Lottie Pierce brought the news. She stood in Randy's yard and said, "Clara Strand is burning up in a wet cabin. The midwife is 3 days away. The doctor in town will not ride the ridge roads until they dry. She needs a stable temperature and a dry room, and she does not have either." Randy thought about the cave. 52 degrees, constant, dry, no drafts, no temperature swings, no damp. It was not warm. 52 degrees on a sick body would need blankets and hot stones, but it was stable, and stability was what fever needed. A body fighting infection could not also fight fluctuating cold. She said yes before she finished thinking. They carried Clara on a makeshift litter, Randy, Lottie, and Eli Hogland, who had come from the schoolhouse when she heard. Clara was heavy with the pregnancy and light with the fever, a combination that made carrying her through the woodshed and the cave entrance an exercise in careful, grunting labor. They laid her on the sleeping platform. Randy piled quilts over her. Kavit lay at her feet, unbidden. This was the first time Randy managed the cave without Tolliff. His lungs had worsened through March. The old mine dust, the accumulated damage of 11 years breathing lead-laced air in narrow tunnels, had thickened into a cough that came in fits and left him gray-faced and still. He came to the ridge less often. When he came, he tired faster. He checked the cave entrance, the stovepipe, the drainage, but he did not stay. Randy applied his lessons alone. No lamp passed the chalk mark Tolliff had drawn on the passage wall. Beyond that point, the air was untested and might not support combustion safely. Door propped open 3 inches for airflow, but the wet blanket hung across the top to catch any smoke trace. Hot stones instead of open flame near the patient. Dry bedding raised off the floor. Water crock within arm's reach. Clara's fever broke on the second night. She woke damp with sweat, confused, asking where she was. Randy told her. Clara put her hand on the cave wall and said, "It feels like October. It always feels like October in here." Clara slept. Her breathing steadied. The fever did not return. She stayed in the cave for 4 more days until she was strong enough to walk, and during those 4 days Randy fed her, kept the stones warm, changed the bedding when the sweat soaked it, and managed the stove and the vents, and the temperature the way Tolliff had taught her, on a schedule, without deviation, measuring instead of guessing. She was no longer copying the mentor. She had become the authority. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival often begins before the storm is visible. Tolliff died on the 11th of April, not in the cave, not in a collapse or a flood, or any of the dramatic endings that cave stories tend to produce. He died on Randy's porch in the afternoon sun, sitting in the chair Amos had built from hickory and rawhide. Kavit lay under his hand. The dog had come to him when Tolliff sat down, as though the dog understood something that the humans had not yet admitted. Tolliff had walked to the ridge that morning to check the upper passage. He wanted to find the air inlet, the opening higher on the ridge where air entered the cave system and began its slow descent through limestone to the woodshed. He had been coughing since dawn. Randy told him to wait. He told her that waiting was for people who had time to waste, and he went. He came back an hour later, gray-faced, moving slowly, with blood on his handkerchief. He sat in the chair. He asked for water. Randy brought it. "The upper opening is 60 yards northeast," he said, "under a limestone overhang, screened by cedar. The air draws through a vertical crack about 8 inches wide. In winter, the warm cave air rises and pulls cold air in from below. In summer, the flow reverses. The cave breathes. It has been breathing since before anyone walked this ridge. You should not have gone alone. I have been going alone for 40 years. A man does not stop because his lungs object." He drank the water. He set the cup on the porch rail. He looked at the woodshed door, which stood open in the April warmth, and through it at the dim outline of the plank door behind the canvas partition. "You will want to screen that upper opening," he said. "Leaves and debris will block it in autumn. A screen of wire mesh, anchored with stones, will keep it clear. If the opening blocks, the air stops, and the cave becomes a room without a window. Do not let that happen. I will screen it. And the back passage. You were right not to explore it without rope and a second lamp, but explore it when you can. Know the full shape of what you have. A passage you do not know is a passage that can surprise you, and I would rather you be surprised by knowledge than by water." Randy sat on the porch step. Kavit had not moved from under Tolliff's hand. "You will be fine," Tolliff said. "You were fine before I came. I taught you the stone. You already knew the rest." He was quiet for a while. The sun moved across the porch. The April air smelled of mud and new growth, and the particular sweetness of an Ozark spring, when everything that has been frozen begins to rot and grow at the same time. "Trust the test," he said, "not the fear." He closed his eyes. His breathing shallowed. Randy sat with him until the breathing stopped, and the dog stayed under his hand, and the afternoon light moved across the porch boards like a slow tide going out. She buried him on the ridge above the woodshed, under a flat limestone marker she carried from the cave entrance. She carved his name with the mason's chisel he had given her. She did not cry at the burial. She cried that night, alone in the cave chamber, where the stone held its 52 degrees, and the silence was complete enough that no one heard her but the dog. The knowledge remained. The hands that taught her were still. But the lessons lived in her own hands now, in the way she tapped a wall before trusting it, in the way she read a candle flame for air quality, in the way she thought about heat not as something to make, but as something to keep. Tolef Vangen had recognized competence in a widow with limestone dust on her sleeves, and he had answered it with everything he knew. The debt she owed him was not the kind that appeared in ledgers. It was the kind that was paid by teaching someone else. Pike had stopped laughing. Pike had started maneuvering. Through April and into May, as the ridge dried and the settlement returned to planting and fence mending and the ordinary business of a life not spent fighting for survival, Pike worked quietly. He petitioned the county assessor for a mineral survey of the Brecka claim. He hinted to neighbors that the cavern might contain marketable calcium deposits, not lead, not saltpeter, but the kind of industrial limestone that railroad companies bought for ballast and road grade. If the survey found marketable stone, the tax assessment would increase. If the assessment increased beyond Randy's ability to pay, the claim would go to auction. And Pike, who held the existing note and who had cash from a winter of elevated prices, would be the buyer. He did not announce this plan. He worked it through the county offices, through the assessor's clerks, through the language of procedure and regulation that turned private ambition into public process. Randy heard about it from Merriweather, who heard about it from the assessor's deputy, who owed Merriweather a favor from the war. He is not wrong about the procedure, Merriweather said. If the county orders a survey, you cannot refuse it, and if the survey finds marketable material, the assessment changes. That is the law. The cave is limestone. Every hill on this ridge is limestone. If they survey my cave, they survey every hill in the county. Pike is not asking them to survey every hill. He is asking them to survey yours, because yours is the one someone is living in. Randy looked at the woodshed door. Behind it, the cave breathed its steady breath, the air moving through passages that had been moving air since before the settlement existed, since before the Osage walked the ridge, since before anything human had looked at this stone and thought about what it could hold. Then I need to pay the note, she said. Before the survey. If Pike holds no paper on me, he has no standing to request an assessment of my property. The note is $28. You have $8. Then I need $20, and I need it before Pike's petition reaches the assessor's desk. Merriweather looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she did not expect. You have a constant temperature storage chamber that every farmer on this ridge needs, and none of them have. Seed potatoes, apples, cider, sorghum, anything that spoils in heat or freezes in cold. You are sitting on the most valuable root cellar in the county, and you have been giving away the knowledge for free. Randy had not thought of it that way. She had been so focused on survival, on the immediate problem of not dying, on the next problem of teaching others not to die, that she had not considered the cave as an economic asset. But Merriweather was right. 52 degrees year-round, dry, constant, the perfect storage temperature for everything a farm produced that needed to last. I will not charge for the knowledge, she said. Tolef did not charge me. Charge for the storage. The knowledge is free. The space is not. It was the most practical thing Merriweather had ever said to her, and it landed in her mind like a seed finding soil. Randy began charging for storage on the 1st of May. The terms were simple. She cleared the second chamber, the room beyond the main sleeping space, 6 feet across with a dry floor and a ceiling Tolef had tested and declared sound, and divided it into sections with chalk lines on the wall. Each section could hold 4 bushels of produce, a cider barrel, or 8 sealed crocks. She charged 25 cents per section per month, or the equivalent in labor, fence mending, firewood cutting, mule work, anything she could not do alone. The price was low enough that even the poorest farms on the ridge could afford it, and high enough that 12 families storing through a full season would cover Pike's note with room to spare. The first customer was Harlan Pierce, who brought 3 bushels of seed potatoes he needed to keep through the summer without sprouting or rotting. In his root cellar, summer temperatures climbed into the 70s, and the potatoes went soft by July. In Randy's cave, 52 degrees year-round, the potatoes would hold firm until planting. Harlan carried the bushels in himself. He set them in the chalk-marked section, straightened, and looked at the ceiling, the walls, the still air, the thermometer reading its constant 52. He did not say anything about the cave. He said, "Lottie wants me to tell you that the drainage trench you drew for our cellar has held through 2 rainstorms. She says to tell you it is not madness anymore. Tell Lottie I appreciated the quilt. She knows." Within 2 weeks, 7 families had stored produce. Marta Keel brought apple barrels. Eli Hoglan brought school supplies. Chalk, ink, the 3 textbooks the county had issued, because her schoolhouse attic reached 90 degrees in summer, and the heat warped the book bindings. A family from the lower road brought sorghum and cider. A bachelor named Orrin Tate brought smoked hams he could not keep in his cabin because the heat drew flies. Randy kept a ledger. She wrote each family's name, what they stored, the date it went in, and the fee or labor owed. She kept the ledger in the cave, where the ink would not run in summer humidity and the pages would not curl. The cave stored its own records the way it stored everything else, steadily, without fuss, at 52 degrees. By the end of June, she had earned $14 in cash and traded for enough labor to re-shingle the cabin's weak spots, re-chink the north wall properly with a lime and horsehair mixture that Meriwether recommended, and stack 3 cords of oak for the following winter. The north wall, which had nearly killed her, now held its daubing through the summer heat without cracking. The cabin was not perfect, but it was sound, and sound was a word that had not applied to anything on Randy's ridge since Amos died. She needed $20 to clear Pike's note. She had 14. The gap was closing. Pike's mineral survey petition reached the county assessor in late May, and the assessor did what assessors do when petitioned by a storekeeper with political connections. He scheduled a visit. The assessor was a man named Lyman Goss, 51, county employee, uncomfortable on horseback and more uncomfortable on Ozark Ridge trails that his horse did not trust. He arrived on a Wednesday in early June with a surveyor's chain, a notebook, and the particular expression of a man who would rather be in his office. Randy met him at the porch. She had expected this. She had prepared. "Mr. Goss, I understand you are here to assess my claim for mineral value. I am here to inspect a reported subsurface feature and determine whether it warrants reassessment. Standard procedure, Mrs. Bricky." Standard procedure, of course. She led him to the woodshed. She opened the cave door. She held a candle inside and let him see the chamber, the sleeping platform, the storage sections, the chalk marks, the thermometer, the quilts, the crocks. Goss peered inside. He did not enter. He wrote in his notebook. He asked, "What is the extent of the feature?" The main chamber is 9 by 14 feet. A second chamber of approximately 6 by 8 feet lies beyond. A passage continues deeper but is unexplored and inaccessible without equipment. What is the composition? Limestone and dolomite. No mineral veins, no lead, no saltpeter, no calciumite. I have had the walls examined by a man who spent 11 years in the Lee diggings and 4 years in saltpeter caves. His assessment was that the stone is common Ozark limestone with no marketable mineral content, Goss wrote. He looked at the walls from the entrance. He did not touch them. He did not take samples. He wrote, Limestone, common, and closed his notebook. Mrs. Brecka, in my professional opinion, this feature does not warrant mineral reassessment. It is a natural limestone cavity consistent with the karst geology of this region. Every ridge in this county contains similar features. If I reassessed your claim for containing a limestone cave, I would need to reassess every property between here and the Arkansas line. He paused. He looked at the storage sections, the chalk marks, the crocks of sorghum, and the apple barrels. What I see here is a root cellar, an unusually good root cellar, built into a natural feature, but a root cellar nonetheless. Root cellars do not change tax assessments. He rode down the trail. Randy watched him go and felt something loosen in her chest that she had been holding tight since Pike's first visit with the assessor's paper. Pike would hear the result within the week. His petition had failed. The cave was not mineral. The assessment would not change. The taxes would not increase. And when Randy paid the note, $6 more, a month's worth of storage fees, Pike would hold no paper on her at all. The note was paid on the 14th of July. Randy walked into Pike's general merchandise with $28 in cash, coins and crumpled bills counted out from the coffee tin that no longer held $11.40, but held nothing because everything in it had been committed to this moment. She spread the money on the counter the way Pike had once spread her ledger. $28, she said. The coffin, the freight, the nails, the salt pork, paid in full. Pike counted it. He counted it again. He wrote paid across the bottom of the ledger page and dated it. He did not look at her. I will need a receipt, Randy said. He wrote the receipt. She folded it and put it in her coat. The same coat she had worn the day he cut her credit. The same coat with limestone dust still ground into the seams. She turned to leave. Mrs. Brecka. Pike's voice stopped her at the door. She turned. His face held something she had not seen before. Not respect. Pike did not respect things he could not profit from, but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who has run the numbers and discovered that the equation he built has produced an answer he did not expect. I underestimated you, he said. It was the closest Judson Pike had ever come to an apology, and it was not close at all. Randy nodded once and walked out into the July heat with the receipt in her pocket and the note erased and the ridge, for the first time since Amos died, entirely hers. But Pike's reckoning was not finished. The ridge was not done with him. The following October, as the settlement prepared for its second winter since the Blue Norther, Pike's own store cellar failed. He had used the underground space beneath his store for everything: kerosene tins, potato sacks, damp hides waiting for the tanner, flour, lard, and a barrel of turpentine he kept for trade. The cellar had no ventilation. Pike had sealed every crack to keep mice out, and in doing so, he had created exactly the conditions that killed the unnamed settler during the storm: a closed space with no air exchange. The kerosene fumes and turpentine vapor built through the warm autumn. When Pike went down with a lantern to retrieve a keg of nails, the vapor ignited. The fire was small. It caught a pile of burlap sacking and burned itself out before it reached the kerosene tins. But the smoke filled the sealed cellar in seconds, and Pike came up the ladder coughing, blind, with singed eyebrows and a terror in his face that the settlement had never seen. The cellar was ruined. The smoke had fouled the flour, tainted the lard, and left a residue on everything that would take weeks to clean. The potatoes were unusable, smoke-flavored and coated with soot. The hides were worthless. Pike needed help. He needed someone who understood ventilation, air movement, and the difference between a sealed room and a breathing one. He needed, specifically, the woman whose cave he had tried to tax out from under her. He did not come to her. He sent a message through Harlan Pierce asking whether Mrs. Brecka would be willing to advise on cellar ventilation. The word advise was Pike's way of asking for help without saying the word. Randy went. She walked into Pike's store cellar with a candle, the way she walked into every underground space now, flame first, watching for lean, watching for steadiness, reading the air the way Tolef had taught her. The air was dead. No movement. The cellar was a box with one entrance and no exit, sealed on every surface, a tomb for anything living and a trap for anything volatile. She told Pike what needed to change. 2 vents, one high, one low, on opposite walls, nigh, to create a cross draft that would carry fumes up and out. A separation between flammable stores and food stores, with a plank partition and a second vent for the flammable side. A drain in the floor, angled toward a gravel sump, so that spilled liquid would not pool. And the most important change, never, under any circumstances, carry an open flame into a sealed space that contains volatile materials. Pike listened. He did not argue. He did not question. He stood in his own ruined cellar with soot on his shirt and the smell of singed burlap in his hair, and he listened to the woman he had tried to dispossess explain the principles that would have prevented the disaster he had caused. When she finished, she said, "I will need you to carry the materials yourself. I will mark the vent locations and the partition line. You will do the labor. I can hire. You will do it yourself. You need to understand what the air does and why. If you hire someone, you learn nothing, and next winter you will make the same mistake in a different way." Pike's jaw worked. Half the settlement was watching from the store above. Merriweather, Harlan Pierce, Lottie, Orrin Tate, 3 men from the crossroads who had come for nails and stayed for the show. They watched Judson Pike pick up a shovel and begin digging the first vent channel under the direction of the woman whose credit he had cut 10 months ago. Merriweather leaned against the store counter and said nothing. His silence was louder than anything he could have spoken. Pike dug. Randy directed. The vents went in. The partition went up. The drain was cut. It took 2 days, and during those 2 days, Pike carried sacks, moved barrels, shoveled gravel, and followed instructions with the grim compliance of a man who understands that the alternative is worse. When it was finished, Randy lit a candle at the low vent and watched the flame lean inward. The cellar was breathing, the air moving, the space transformed from a sealed box into a living room that could hold stores without killing the man who entered it. 25 cents a month for the consultation, Randy said. Same as everyone else. Pike paid. Arne Lund came to the ridge in November of 1905, a year after the Blue Norther, driving a wagon loaded with ash and hickory lumber, and a daughter named Sigrid, who was 7 years old, and who had survived one of Eli Hoagland's cellar lessons at the schoolhouse during a late spring storm. Arnie was 42, widowed. A wagon maker by trade, trained in Decorah, Iowa, and settled on the lower Current River Road, where the timber was good and the water powered a small lathe he had built himself. His wife had died of childbed fever 3 years earlier, and he had raised Sigrid alone with the help of neighbors and the particular competence of a man who could build anything that had joints and grain. He came because Sigrid had described the schoolhouse storm room, the quilted corner Eli had built from Randy's design, and Arne wanted to build something similar in his workshop, where he spent long hours in winter and where the stove consumed wood faster than his patience allowed. Randy showed him the cave. She showed him the principles. She drew the diagrams on the plank with chalk, the same diagrams she had drawn for Lottie, for Eli, for Marta, for a dozen others. Arne studied them with the eye of a man who understood joinery and structure and the way materials behaved under stress. "Your door is hung wrong," he said. Randy looked at the plank door she had built, 3 boards, battened, hinged with leather strips. It worked. It had worked through the Blue Norther and every cold night since. She did not see the problem. Leather stretches, Arna said. In damp air, the leather hinges will swell and sag. By next winter, the door will drag on the threshold. By the winter after, it will not close. You need iron hinges pinned with a gap for the pin to move without binding. I do not have iron hinges. I do. He went to the wagon and came back with a pair of hand-forged strap hinges, the kind a wagon maker keeps in stock because wagon gates need hinges that hold under load. He removed the leather strips, mortised the hinge plates into the door frame, and hung the door in 20 minutes. It swung cleanly, settled against the frame without dragging, and latched with a wooden turn catch he carved from a scrap of ash. Randy watched him work. His hands moved the way Tolef's hands had moved, with the economy of a person who has done the same motions 10,000 times. But where Tolef's competence was underground, in stone and darkness, Arnie's was in wood and light. He read grain the way Tolef read limestone layers. He found the bedline in a plank the way Tolef found it in a bluff. The airflow is wrong too, he said, examining the canvas partition. The airflow works. The airflow works now. In 3 years, the canvas will rot. You need a plank partition with a sliding vent, adjustable. Some nights you want more air from the cave. Some nights you want less. A canvas sheet gives you one setting. A sliding vent gives you control. You are criticizing my woodshed. I am improving your woodshed. There is a difference. The difference is that I did not ask. Arne looked at her. Then he laughed, a short surprise sound. The laugh of a man who has been told something true and recognizes it. You're right, I apologize. I see a hinge problem and I fix it. It is a fault. It is a fault that comes with useful hinges. I will accept the fault this time. He smiled. She did not smile back, but something shifted in the space between them. Not warmth exactly, but the removal of a barrier. The acknowledgement that competence recognized competence and that recognition did not require either of them to be less than they were. Arnie came back the following week to build the plank partition. He brought Sigri, who played with Kivit in the yard, while Arne and Randy argued over the vent placement. He wanted it at chest height. She wanted it at knee height because warm air rose and she needed to control the cooler air at floor level, not the warmer air above. You are thinking about the cave air, Arne said. I am thinking about the stove air. The stove air is your problem. The cave air is my problem. We are solving different problems with the same vent. They compromised. 2 vents, one at knee height, one at chest height, both with sliding covers. It was better than either design alone, and neither of them said so, because saying so would have been admitting that the argument had been necessary, and admitting that felt too much like admitting something else. The courtship, if it could be called that, proceeded through carpentry. Arna built a better shelf for the storage chamber. Randy corrected his drainage angle. He replaced the sawhorses under the sleeping platform with proper bed rails, mortised and pinned. She showed him how to whitewash the cave walls near the entrance with salt and lime paste to reduce moisture. He argued that the paste would soften the stone. She argued that her father had used it for 30 years without softening anything. They tested it on a small section and checked it after 2 weeks. The stone was fine. Randy did not say she had told him so. She did not need to. Sigri began calling the cave the dog cave, because Kavit slept beside the entrance every night and would not be moved. By February of 1906, Arne had repaired the cabin porch, rebuilt the mule pen, and replaced every leather hinge on the property with iron. Randy had taught him to tap stone for hollow sounds, to read a candle flame for air quality, and to think about heat as something protected rather than something produced. They had argued about hinge placement, vent height, shelf depth, whitewash composition, the proper angle for a drainage trench, and whether Kivit preferred cornmeal or biscuit scraps. They had not argued about anything that mattered, because the things that mattered had already been settled in the work. They married in March, in the cabin, with Meriwether and Lottie Pierce as witnesses, and Sigri holding Kavit by the collar to keep him from eating the cake Lottie had baked. The ceremony was short. The minister was borrowed from the settlement below. The vows were standard. The life they built afterward was not. The winters that followed were cold, but not catastrophic. The Blue Norther of February 1905 remained the worst in living memory, and the settlement measured every subsequent winter against it the way a town measures floods against the high water mark on the bridge pier. Each year, more families modified their homes using the principles Randy had taught. Banked earth against north walls, interior storm corners with quilted partitions, root cellars rebuilt with drainage trenches, threshold slopes, and paired vents. Smaller heated spaces inside larger structures, because heating the space where the bodies slept cost a quarter of the wood that heating the full cabin consumed. Arna built doors for 3 of the modified cellars. He developed a standard design, plank construction, iron hinges, sliding vent, wooden latch that he traded for labor, produce, or small cash. Randy inspected each cellar before the family used it, checking air movement, drainage, ceiling stability, and the flower mark test for water intrusion. She never charged for the inspection. The storage fees covered her needs. The knowledge was free. By the 3rd winter, 19 families in the district had adopted some part of the method. Only 3 had caves. The rest had modified cellars, banked walls, or storm rooms built from Randy's designs. The principle had spread past the specific solution into something broader, the understanding that winter was not a battle to be won with more fuel, but a problem to be managed with less loss. Meriwether, at a winter preparation gathering held at the schoolhouse in October of 1907, stood before the assembled families and said what he had been circling for 3 years. He spoke without notes, in the plain language he used for everything. 3 years ago, I rode up to the break-a claim and told a widow she had wood for November, not winter. I told her the truth as I understood it, and I was wrong. He paused. I was not wrong about the wood. She did not have enough wood. I was wrong about what wood was for. I counted cords. She counted what the cold could steal. I measured fuel. She measured loss. And the difference between those 2 measurements is the reason she is standing here today, and the reason some of you are sitting in rooms she taught you how to build. The room was quiet. Meriwether was not a man who made speeches. The fact that he was making one now gave the words a weight that no emphasis could have added. I do not say this to praise Mrs. Lund, he said, using her married name. I say it because I was the most experienced winter hand on this ridge, and I was wrong, and the person who was right was a widow with a dog and a hole in her woodshed. If I can be wrong about something I have done for 40 years, so can any of you. Listen to her, not because she survived, because she understood something the rest of us missed. He sat down. Randy did not speak. She did not need to. Meriwether had said the thing she could not say for herself, and he had said it in front of the people whose respect she needed, and whose trust she had earned 1 cellar, 1 storage fee, 1 chalk diagram at a time. The years compress the way years do when the crisis has passed, and the life that follows is steady and full. Arna and Randy had 2 children, a boy named Peter, after her father, and a girl named Tollef's surname was too unusual for a first name, so they named her Kristen and gave her a middle name the family did not use in public, but that Randy spoke sometimes in the cave, when she was alone with the stone and the silence and the memory of the man who had taught her how to listen to a wall. Kavit aged. His muzzle went gray. His hips stiffened. He stopped digging and started sleeping, always beside the cave entrance, always on the limestone threshold he had first torn open with his paws. When he died, in the summer of 1912, in his sleep, on the flat stone where he had spent every night for 8 years, Randy buried him above the woodshed, 10 feet from Tolef's marker, under a flat limestone slab she carried from the second chamber. She carved his name with the mason's chisel. The chisel was Tolef's. The stone was the bluff's. The dog was hers and always had been. The cave remained. It served as storage, as storm shelter, as sick room twice more over the following decade. Randy kept apples, seed corn, quilts, and storm candles in the main chamber. The second chamber held the settlement's collective surplus. Barrels and crocks and sacks belonging to families who paid their quarter and knew their goods would be waiting, unchanged when they came for them. The temperature never varied. 52 degrees in January, 52 degrees in August. The stone held its season. Within 5 winters of the Blue Norther, at least 19 families in the district had copied some part of Randy's method. Banked walls, interior storm rooms, cellar vents, drainage trenches, or the dry earth pantries that Marta Keel had perfected from Randy's original design. Only 3 had caves, but all of them understood the principle. The lesson was not find a cavern. The lesson was stop giving heat away faster than you can make it. Randy Lund lived out her life on the ridge with Arne and the children, keeping the woodshed door in working order long after she no longer needed to sleep behind it. She stored apples and seed corn and quilts and storm candles in the chamber, and she kept Tolef's mason's chisel on a nail beside the entrance, and she kept the mercury thermometer on the wall where it had hung since October of 1904, its needle fixed at the same mark it had held through the worst cold the ridge had ever seen. Years later, a young widow on the lower road, a woman whose husband had died in a logging accident, who had 2 children and a leaking cabin and no money for 6 cords of oak, came to Randy and asked for help. Randy took her to the cave. She held a candle to the entrance and let the woman watch the flame lean inward and steady. She placed the woman's hand on the wall. "What does it feel like?" Randy asked. "October," the woman said. Randy nodded. She picked up the chalk and began to draw, and behind the stacked oak, where a dog once tore his paws bloody against loose stone, the mountain kept its season.